outs. Stand up, stand outs. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're standing up and they're standing out for freedom and in their part of ship in the things that they're concerned with. And one of the important subjects that we covered, I believe, in almost every meeting was attempting to interpret the actual events that are going on in the world around us, attempting to interpret them. And it's not an easy task because conventional thinking. This is where I'm finding it interesting because it's actually stretching my thinking by even trying to understand thinking. But conventional thinking thinks in, if you like, an either or fashion, and that is that we think it's either left or it's right, we think it's black or it's white, and and in this, I would describe that particular type of thinking as essentially dialectical. Dialectical. And I believe we've been trained in that fashion from our earliest days at school. In actual fact, it's an ancient form of indoctrination to think dialectically. And I'm going to explore this over today's program because I believe that it's an incorrect fashion of thinking. But it's based on the philosophy, Manichaeistic dualism. You can call it modern philosophy of Marxist dialectics. It really is an extension of the same pagan philosophy that goes back. I've read books that bring it back to the second and third century AD, of where these forms of paganism were prominent. And of course, they've evolved. And nowadays, at least the last 200 years, certainly heavily influenced, um, at least the last 150 years, by Marx and his writing, Karl Marx and Lenin, and of course the Communist Manifesto, which is immersed in dialectics. Now, I'm just going to place that there on the table and I'll just push it aside because I want to actually place another thought alongside it. And the thought is either or. Either or. Now, I'm not going to go too far into depth about it, but I believe that the world, by its nature, is Trinitarian. Time, space, matter, past, present, future, height, width, breadth, solid, liquid, gas. These are trinities, as is um, husband, wife, and child. These are trinities, and so to me, the universe, the world we live in, is actually um, immersed within this, if you like, signature of the nature of reality, and that is Trinitarian, rather than um, dialectic or dualistic or yin yang. And so to me, these are contrary philosophies, at least attempting to bind back reality um, to the nature of what it is. One being, yeah, dialectics or dualism, and the other being Trinitarianism. So no doubt you've got many thoughts on this, Wallace. I'll give you the floor.
Well, yes, I think, Arnie, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're saying is that the nature of reality is that it is functional, that it is balanced, and because it's balanced, it is functional. Whereas this dualistic approach assumes that all progress, so certainly the Marxist approach, is that all progress is due to conflict. And from conflict, thesis and antithesis, you have what emerges as a synthesis. In other words, understanding, knowledge, and social forms, and so on, actually develops from conflict, not from balance and harmony. Is that what you're saying?
It is, Wallace, and you've actually what you've done is you've brought to mind some actual reading material, and I'm just going to cut across to our league website. I'll just clear that title there. To our league website in our library, and there are several booklets, one of which I am going to put up possibly as early as today. The first one is in regard to dialectics by Butler, E.D. Dialectics, and I had a read of this. I actually laid it out. It takes about an hour and to read, and it's interesting because what it's done from my point of view is it's actually explained certain thinking and also how to discuss things. And if you like, the thinking of the Marxist which is different from the thinking of the normal person. They are different. And I think it's most important that we actually begin to come to grips with this, with the meaning of words and the things that we say and the things that they say. And they may appear on the surface to be identical things, but in actual fact, there's an entirely different narrative being presented from the Marxist point of view. Wally.
Well, the thing of it is, language is considered by the Marxists to be a very important tool in promoting revolution, because language is the means by which we derive understanding and the way we communicate. And it is very deceptive for the average person, because when a Marxist says something, he is likely meaning something else. We would assume that he means something of a conventional nature, whereas he actually means something else. And so when you are arguing with a Marxist, or when the Marxist is trying to promote certain social or economic policies, they are actually speaking a different language. And it is very difficult for you to defend yourself or to comprehend the nature of an argument or a discussion if you can't speak the same language. And especially if the language is being deliberately used in order to mislead you and put you off guard. And so many people are put in that position because the average person is probably brought up with the idea that we should try to be consistent and we should try to be honest and try to make sense out of things. Whereas the Marxist uses language to distort that, to divert our attention away from that particular method of thinking. And in that way, we can be put off guard, and we can be completely, if you want, vulnerable to an approach that we just don't understand.
I'd like to give an illustration here, Wallace, and it's something that I recently used when I was in a forum with some people, and that is the the left and the right of politics. The left and the right of politics. It's presented that the left may be strong on environmentalism and the right may be strong on conservatism or industry, self-reliance and industry. But in actual fact, the whole discussion about the left, if you follow the left of politics far enough, you'll find that it goes to totalitarianism. And if you follow the right of politics far enough, you'll find that it also goes to totalitarianism. And so, in order to decipher what appears to be confusion, a paradox, it's not actually a paradox at all. The history of the left and the right in politics goes back to the French Revolution. And the revolutionaries, who were all totalitarian, some were to the left of the, if you like, the speaker in the parliament, and some were to the right of the speaker in the parliament, but they were all totalitarian. Now, I put it to you, if you in attempt to understand the left and the right of politics, you have to actually undo the narrative and place totalitarianism at one end of the spectrum and freedom, or if you like, almost anarchy, where there is so little government, you would call it anarchy, but anarchy in itself says no government and chaos. But I'd suggest that really a proper definition of the other end of the spectrum to totalitarianism is freedom with responsibility. And that to me is the left and the right, if you like, or one end of the spectrum to the other. Both the left and the right are moving towards totalitarianism, and it doesn't matter. We certainly experience it here in Australia, and I know you're doing it in Canada and in America, Britain the same. That both the left and the right of politics are directly heading towards totalitarianism. It is the direction they are heading. They are taking more and more power away from the individual and placing it in the hands of either the bureaucracy or the state of some fashion. And so they're heading towards totalitarianism, unquestionably. And we need to recognize that when a politician is talking, if his mouth is moving, he's talking in a fashion that you need to decipher the riddles. Otherwise, if you don't decipher it, you'll be confused about what they're actually saying. Wallace.
That's right, whether he knows it or not. He also is often confused. but they're often, of course, cynical as well and don't really want to look at things in an objective way because politics is a game of power.
Mm.
It's with regard to you see, the Marxist separates the worker from the capitalist. Now, naturally, the capitalist and the worker should have a common interest because they're both engaged in a project which is creating something which should be useful and beneficial to mankind. But the Marxist puts the two in opposition to each other, in conflict with each other. And of course, that's dysfunctional. It doesn't help the success of the enterprise when you have conflict.
Mm.
And so, I mean, there should be a fusion or a union of purpose between those who organize the forces of production and those who simply work within it to assist in that function. And this is a really serious problem because we've been projected into an abnormal, unnatural situation where we're not working together harmoniously to have a good life, to have the best in life. We are actually at odds with each other. And that, again, is the dialectic at work. It's a question of violence, violently opposing alleged opposites, but opposites which are not really opposites, but are only portrayed as opposites.
Mm.
And that way they can generate the hostility and the conflict that they need in order to play in politics in a way to centralize power.
That's a very
The,
outstanding observation, Wallace, because I can give a couple of for instances that I'm seeing every day. We talk about the left and right of politics and if you like, the conflagration between them, supposedly different, but in actual fact both towards totalitarianism. But the opposites we see in the community, the male and the female, the actual the antagonism that's being fostered in order to break down society, the Me Too movement, the feminist movement. These are to break the family apart instead of actually being conducive to a wholesome relationship and family being, of course, the seat of nurturing for the next generation. It becomes a place of hostility, and that we see that in every society nowadays, of course, with the liberal divorce laws and things like that, and of course the promoting of anti-family situations, so that if one is offended, it's given huge publicity that all are offended by a particular action. And another illustration is, if you like, the generational antagonism that's being produced at the moment between if you like, the millennials who have no future, who have been offered no future by essentially a totalitarian policy, and blaming or assisted in blaming that no future on the older generation who are supposed to have had so much. And of course, that's an intergenerational, cross-generational conflict, one of envy and one of jealousy. And
yes.
it's not actually true. What is true is that the younger generation are being stifled by debt as policy in order to bring about this antagonism, this conflict. It's a very deliberate policy.
Yes, it is.
What we've got to look at in order to decipher what's going on is how do we actually regain control of the narrative? Because the narrative is being driven predominantly by mainstream media, now even by industry. Now even by industry. So you've got politics, media, and industry involved in this. It really is becoming a totalitarian environment that we're living in, and we are losing control of the narrative, and we are listening to the narrative presented to us instead of looking at the natural world, the real world, where in a relationship of mutual love and cooperation, this is the environment that we need to actually look at, the Trinitarian relationship. Wallace.
Well, you mentioned love, and that is absolutely the core of the whole thing. Man and woman are are designed to carry out a joint operation, if you want, or function. They have their mission is to have a family and to have a family in harmony and operating with mutual love. And this dialectic breaks down love because it puts people in competition with each other. Instead of unifying them in love, it breaks them into competing entities. And of course, that is the Marxist approach from the standpoint of economics. You have the two, the capitalist and the labor in conflict with each other. And you see, from a social credit standpoint, we have a problem here. There is something that is missing, and that something that is missing is what allows the conflict to come into being. Mm-hmm. And that thing, that entity that is missing is inheritance. That's universal right. Inheritance.
Yes, I agree.
If there's no inheritance, there is scarcity, and people are fighting, struggling amongst each other mm-hmm. in order to get what they consider to be an equitable or a necessary share of whatever is available. Mm-hmm. And it is a completely artificial thing that is being brought about by provocative propaganda and constant brainwashing to convince everyone that they seem to be in conflict with everyone else. And everything has got to be solved through justice. Well, justice means legalism. Mm-hmm. And legalism means constant conflict within the courts, contesting, and it is very fractious and irritating. It does not generate the type of relationship you have when you're relating according to love. It's a completely different thing. And that's what being driven to, like the United States, extremely legalistic. They're suing each other all the time. It's a way of life almost, you would think, in observing things. Mm. I don't want to become jaded, but it really does look that way. Mm.
I think an interesting point, you touched on the United States, and I read the other day in regard to the Eastern Bloc, and I call the Eastern Bloc, you can call it BRICS, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS group, all hardline communist nations, all hardline communist nations. I don't know that there's anything, it's a real truth in the word hardline. I think if you're a communist, you're a hardline, that's it. But the point is that that is the Eastern Bloc, if you like, and the Western Bloc being Europe and perhaps America. And in this conflict between these two, we see that in this conflict, Venezuela has had foreign troops come into its shores, both Chinese and I'll call them Soviets. I won't call them Russian. They're Soviet troops because I think if we call those troops that came from Russia Russian, then people get the wrong idea. It's Soviet troops. It's actually the outworking of the communist government, and they're now in Venezuela on invitation by the socialist or communist government in Venezuela. That country's just been invaded.
Yes, I think the Cubans are there too.
Yeah, and that country's just been invaded, and we're discussing in Australia whether the lights are on or not on in Venezuela, but we're not looking any deeper at all into the actual outworking of this dialectic, where the clashes of opposites, or the clashing of opposites, has actually caused a country to be lost and taken over. And of course, the poor Venezuelan people, they're seeing the outworking of that. In reading this book on dialectics, I appreciate what's going on, and to me it now clarifies the role that the Soviets are playing, and I won't call them Russian. I believe they're still Soviets. The role that the Soviets and the Communist Chinese are playing in this whole narrative, and then being openly supported in this conflict by the military-industrial complex, the other form of the totalitarian regime of America. It's absolutely amazing. To me, it has actually deciphered what's gone on. And that's why it's most important to actually go for it, because I know these aren't easy these aren't easy observations to place on the table, but they're my observations after having read the book, because it wasn't clear to me. But once I read the book, it became clear that they're talking in a different language and the meaning of words and the actual outworking of this dialectic. Wallace.
Well, the thing of it is, we're all in conflict. We're all competing, and that's what leads to all of this international competition, this international occupation, this international domination. All nations, because of this, you see, in the price system, there is a defect. We are generating costs and prices more rapidly, a greater rate of volume than we are incomes. And of course, every nation is faced with the struggle of trying to how to fill this gap in order to make it possible for their people to obtain what they're producing. And so the struggle for markets where you can export more than you import is forced. It's not natural trade. It's not just this for that. It's war. It's economic war,
Mm.
and that of course Venezuela of course is a source, a very large source of petroleum products. I
Heavy,
think it's the
heavy
fifth.
crude, yeah, heavy crude it is. It's a lucrative crude. It's very heavy in tars and
Yes,
bitumens and things like that. Yeah.
I think the third largest in the world, if I'm not
Mm.
mistaken.
And
And
diamonds and gold. Yeah.
mhm.
Mm.
So, I mean, there's a struggle for wealth amongst nations that way in order to try and survive domestically and internationally. And it's just constant conflict and war. It's there is no peace, there is no harmony, there is no rest.
Mm.
It goes on forever, and of course, it gets worse because the more you modernize your economy, the bigger the gap gets for certain accounting reasons. The bigger the gap gets between your total costs and prices and your available incomes, whereby to buy the product and liquidate the costs that have been
Mm.
generated.
So
So
what you're illustrating, Wallace, is that the financial system is actually designed to complement this dialectical materialism, this conflict.
absolutely,
It's designed to actually cause the conflict, and so it's consistent with the philosophy. And that's why we, as audience and participators in the economy and in the world today, we need to actually learn another language. And it's this language of dialectics, because
you're right.
we won't understand what's going on until we actually take into account dialectical thinking. I know this is an infancy, and I know this is really an introduction. It's the deep end, and it's not easy study. I've been at this for a long, long time, and so has Wallace. And the fact is that only rereading these books, I get to a certain point where I hold this information, but I have to reread them to reinforce the thinking, and then the deciphering comes. And but in the end, you've got to ask the question, and this is where we need to go in this forum today, I believe, Wallace. The question: how do we actually work our way through? How do we have to renew our minds, and how do we actually change our thinking patterns in order to find resolution, not revolution?
I think, Arnie, we have to look at nature. Nature, certain beings, creatures come into being in nature, and nature provides for them. They don't have to go out and get a job and get paid money before they can actually claim. If an organism in nature finds a morsel, it's free to eat it. It's provided. And we have this ethic, this Puritan ethic, which says that we must not have anything unless we earn it. Now, God gives us life, gives us all of these things as a gift. And that offends many people. That offends many people because their ego, their pride, induces them to want to earn everything that they get as though that was their justification.
Mm,
But as we know, we have expended untold amount of energy and materials in pure useless activities and destructive activities, in destroying Europe twice last, or a good part of Europe last century, and continuing the wars ever since. This is not benefiting anyone. This is destruction. It is waste. And so you see, that's where the dialectic comes. We have this conflict in our mind about whether we are justified because we are, or justified because we're working. And it's a destructive thing, but it's a conflicting thing, because the conservatives will say, "Oh well, these lazy people, they're useless eaters. They're not showing enough initiative, and they're not eating. They're not working. They're not contributing their share." And of course, the communists say the same thing essentially, because they will organize you in a manner where you are forced into certain institutionalized behaviors. And as a young communist fellow told me, he said, "We work, but nothing seems to happen." Well, the problem is neither system works, because there is no inheritance. On the one side, with the communists, you work, and you work under direction and under tyranny. On the conservative side, you work, but there's no inheritance. There's a private inheritance, but there's no general inheritance. There's no access to the storehouse.
That's exactly right, Wallace. I just want to explain to the audience about where Wallace is going with this general inheritance. The creation of the wheel, the creation of the lever or the fulcrum, the steam locomotive, the Stephenson's rocket, the polyphase rotating magnetic field electric motor with Tesla electric engines, steam turbines, gas turbines, hydraulics, automation, advanced control, computers. These are all parts of our cultural inheritance. And the fact is that if you save up and you're fortunate enough to own a home, you might be able to hand that inheritance when you pass on to your children. But the cultural inheritance that Wallace is talking about, the technology, the advanced control, the fact that you could have robots doing all this work. And if robots are doing all this work, then why the dickens should you have to work? Because the work is already done. Where we are struggling for expanding markets, even if it means that we build bombs like America. 50% of their economy is based on a war machine. 50% of all the people working in America are supporting the war machine in order for them to balance their budget so that people can eat bread. What sort of madness is that? Turn the war machine off, issue them with sufficient credits that the bread that is already there they can eat. It's not they can't, there's no bread, therefore let them eat cake. There is cake. The fact is there is an abundance there. And we've deceitfully had it stolen from us by the financial system. The financial system is designed to cause conflict. We need to review the design of the financial system. Wallace.
It's deprived us of our inheritance. In nature, things happen. You have energy that works upon material goods, and things just simply flow. There are conversions, and things flow. Nature abhors a vacuum. Things tend to flow to fill. And but you see, we have a different form of association. We do these things, but we reflect them at a second level by money and contract, and that would, we would assume that should reflect the realities that go on, but it doesn't reflect the realities that go on, because there's no way that things just flow in our society. I can't just go over to the store and take a loaf of bread if I wanted, or a bottle of milk. I can't do that. I've got to pay for it, and I can't pay for it until I go out and work for it. And you see, it's a very different situation. And with all this technology you're talking about, labor is being literally and rapidly and massively displaced. It's being cast aside because it's not needed. There is an abundance that is enormous. But because we have it's dictated to us that we can only obtain things with money, and money is controlled in the way that it is issued to us, and it is controlled in a way that it's always scarce, in requiring us to mortgage our future in order to obtain what we've already produced. Now, nature doesn't mortgage its future. Nature functions.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so that we've gotten ourselves completely off track.
Mm.
We're dysfunctional,
Mm.
and this is causing all sorts of abnormal hardship, insecurity, and crime.
You're talking about the financial system and it actually generating conflict, and the financial system always being scarce. And the fact is that this question of balancing things in their correct relationship so that they flow, so that industry can produce things. You have the technology, you have the production, you have the, if you like, the consumption in the consumer. But what we don't have is an equitable distribution system. And this is where the beauty of what Douglas saw and proposed with the social credit financial policy, the Douglas social credit financial policy. And I find it fascinating that he saw this 100 years ago. And in that 100 years ago, it was nowhere near what we see in advanced control nowadays, where we've got warehouses driven by robots, delivery systems run by, if you like, administered by drones, administered or outworked by drones. And of course, we're looking at automation in cars, trucks, trains, things like that. If they could, they'd actually have planes doing it as well. But I don't think people would accept planes being driven by robots. And so all these things are being outworked to the point where if no one's working and robots are doing everything, how the dickens are we going to find an equitable distribution system? And this is why social credit to me provides the answer. It shows it clearly that people working in mutual agreement, mutual love and cooperation can actually achieve these things through an equitable financial system. And that to me is the key to the forum today. Closing
Yeah.
comments, Wallace.
Well, the amazing thing is Douglas was an engineer. Douglas was accustomed to dealing with energy and materials, and money was just a facilitator. He had real things to do in the real world.